Hannah Mouse 1 here. Comedy is a subjective thing. Whenever you try to make your media piece funny, you risk alienating a part of your audience who doesn't share your sense of humour. There'll be people who thought that the MCU was never funny to begin with, and people who think that She-Hulk is the funniest thing that this franchise has ever produced. And if you're one of them, that's great, but you might not enjoy this video so much. This is based on the jokes that I found funny and the ones that I thought fell flat, and based on what I've seen, I don't think I'm alone in my verdict. The MCU is steadily getting less and less funny, and I want to dissect why. And if you can't tell, I am slightly ill at the moment. I feel fine, but my voice is kind of going, so sorry if I don't sound quite as with it as I normally do. I think that the MCU demonstrates one golden rule for comedy that can be further dissected into 3 subpoints. The main rule is this: comedy should be intrinsically woven into character. With any story, but especially with one as broad as the MCU, the characters are the piece that the audiences have to connect with. After all, it's hard to connect with any one specific location when every film takes place somewhere completely different, but the characters are always consistent with guest appearances from other films and massive team-up events where you get to see all your favourite characters together. You could almost say that the MCU is not a place, it's a people. So if that's the part of your story that your audience has to connect with, that's where the humour has to stem from. And from there, you should A, give your character a sense of humour, B, give your character funny traits that fit with their personality, and C, let these traits bleed into tragic moments to make them feel more poignant. But let's look at the first idea, giving your character a sense of humour. This is a way of not only making your character funny, but making them unique. People in real life have wildly varying senses of humour, and this should be reflected in your piece, both in the person delivering the jokes and the reception that these jokes receive. Let some people find them funny and other people roll their eyes in disgust. When does your character make a joke and when do they shut up? Depending on the target audience of your piece, how vulgar is your character and their sense of humour? There are plenty of ways of making your character feel individual in their jokes. So let's look at Tony. His humour establishes itself from his wit. He can come up with a witty retort to any comment thrown his way. You've been called the Da Vinci of our time. What do you say to that? Absolutely ridiculous. I don't paint. And he's a constant fountain of nicknames. All of this fits with Tony's snarky personality and the social life he lived as a genius billionaire playboy philanthropist. It also juxtaposes against Cap, whose lower class military background makes him a lot more serious and rigid. Is everything a joke to you? Funny things are. Having this contrast helps to avoid alienating too much of the audience. Tony's humour might make you love him, but if it doesn't gel with you, well, it might turn you off his character. You aren't necessarily alienated from the franchise as a whole because you can still feel represented on screen by Cap's general disdain for Tony's joking around. Along these lines, consider who various characters are willing to make what jokes with. Tony will match wits with anyone who crosses him, but there are also jokes that only work because the characters are such good friends. Jokes that take the mick, deliberately irk someone, all in jest, of course. I am referring to Age of Ultron here, when Cap is teased for his saying language to Tony at the start of the film. It's playful, and while Cap is irritated in the moment, Cap doesn't like that kind of talk. You know what, Romanoff? You can tell it's only friends trying to improve the morale in a trying time and bringing them closer together. And this time, the humour is executed in a way that feels natural enough that even if you don't enjoy the jokes, it's likely that it doesn't take you out of the story. These are just friends acting like friends would. But let's move on to the second point, giving your character traits that can come across as funny. I think the most obvious example of this is Peter Parker, Spider-Man. He's just a starstruck teenager surrounded by his idols, and this causes him to be a bit awkward and so very, very polite. So there's a humorous charm to his apologising for everything, or insisting on calling Agent Hill ma'am, that it's intrinsically tied to his personality, even when he's not trying to be funny. You could also apply this to Star-Lord. He's not trying to be funny when he's rocking out to the music on his headphones. He just loves the music, and I think a lot of us have been there. I love that we get to see both sides of this. From his perspective, he's a cool superhero with a rocking soundtrack like the ones he knows from the films of his youth, but from the outside perspective, he's an idiot. Then there's my third point, which is really just an extension of the first two. Using the traits you gave your characters that make them funny can also be used in tragic moments to make them more poignant. Of course, this is a tricky needle to thread. You don't want to subtract from the moment, but when this is done right, tears. Take this scene before Cap crashes the plane in what he believes to be a sacrifice of his own life. He's talking to Peggy here, and they could have given him a heartfelt goodbye, an apology for what he's about to do, what he's about to take away from her, but no. Instead, through the terror and sadness, he tries to make her, and let's be honest, himself, feel a little better about the situation. He tries to make her laugh. He's about to die, and he's talking about his 2 left feet. You know, I still don't know how to dance. And it only serves as a powerful reminder of what they could have had. It's a careful use of a character's humour to bolster a tragic moment. But Let's apply these points to a case study which I think exemplifies this pretty well. Thor. I don't think there's a more tonally confused character in this franchise than the God of Thunder. In his first outing, 2011's eponymous film Thor is a serious Shakespearean character. That's not to say he's constantly brooding. There are moments where his arrogance causes him to show off with a laugh and a grin, but he's not a walking joke, not by the larger-than-life Asgardian standards anyway. The humour comes from the second point that I made. It's woven into his personality even when he's not trying to be funny. He's a fish out of water, a god walking among mortal men. When he throws his cup onto the floor of the cafe or walks into a pet shop and yells, "I need a horse," he's not trying to be funny. He's the heir apparent to the Asgardian throne. Of course he would act like this. This personality is fairly consistent up through Age of Ultron, gradually becoming more familiar with the ways of Midgard and how to become a wise, benevolent ruler and shedding his arrogant, childish persona of the first film. But hidden in all these films was the poorly received Thor: The Dark World, a film which sparked a pretty significant course correct for Thor's third standalone outing, Thor: Ragnarok. Tonally, this film is a complete pivot from the dark, serious predecessors. It's got colourful settings, a host of comical characters and jokes. Lots of jokes. But again, Thor is very rarely actually trying to crack a joke. When he yells, "He's a friend from work," it's funny because of the casual tone, but it's still just Thor being a bit blasé about his situation. He sees himself as above. When he realises that the person he was terrified of fighting against was his friend, of course he finds it a bit funny. Besides, he's king of Asgard. He's supposed to be defeating Hela and saving his people. And this fight club is little more than an extravagant sideshow in what must feel like an extreme fever dream. Point is, Thor is still grounded enough in his original character that he still feels like Thor. And a lot of people, myself included, really enjoyed Thor: Ragnarok and the version of Thor that it brought to us. And we were wondering whether the tone would carry across to Infinity War. And the answer is a resounding no. Infinity War's Thor is the most serious and brooding and tragic version of him that we ever see. He's lost his mother, his father, his brother, Heimdall, half his people, and he's running on empty. But we do see him exercise point number 3 in his heartbreaking talk with Rocket. He starts off with this air of casual nonchalance about the whole situation, saying things like, "I'm good to go," or "He's never fought me twice," with a bit of a chuckle. He's using humour to try and disguise his pain. But when Rocket doesn't buy it, by the end of the conversation, he's dropped the act. He's more open, resigned. He's in pain. Well, if I'm wrong, then what more can I lose? Infinity War ends with Thor becoming one of the most tragic characters that we ever get in this franchise. He's at the height of his powers. He cuts through the stone's light ray like it's nothing. And it looks like he's going to pound Thanos into the dirt. And he loses. Not they lose, he loses. And I think that's an important distinction, because to Thor, this is absolutely his failure. We've watched the contributions of each of our favourite characters, the decisions and mistakes that led to this moment, but Thor didn't. He's been off-world for years, and while he sees Cap and the rest fighting off Thanos' forces, this isn't like Avengers or Age of Ultron where they fought side by side. This time, they're little more than foot soldiers in a war that he's been fighting alone. A war that he's been fighting to avenge his people, to avenge Eitri's people, to save the universe from a threat that he fought and lost against before. And he lost because he didn't go for the head. This is the Thor we opened with in Endgame. He's miserable, guilt-stricken. He thinks he failed, which of course he did. This is not a comedic portrayal of the character, but when he's confronted with Thanos, confronted with the irreversibility of his error, when he takes out his anger and self-hatred on Thanos, there's a twisted hint of irony in his voice when he says, "I went for the head." It's a small personal joke, a morsel of self-gratification. He's the only one who knows what it truly means, and no one, audience included, finds it funny. Then we get the most controversial version of the God of Thunder, Fat Thor. You can't deliver an opinion on him without someone raising a pitchfork, so take what I say with the knowledge that it's solely my opinion and it's entirely possible, likely, that you have a totally different one. I like Fat Thor. It's not executed perfectly by any stretch. While the fun poking from his friends about his weight might be in character to an extent, it's a bit much for them to be laughing about Cheese Whiz when he's pouring his heart out, or at least Thor should have been somewhat insulted by that. But overall, I think it's an interesting way to take Thor's character. Think of it this way. Thor's entire arc is about worthiness. What makes you worthy? Are you more or less worthy than you think you are? Way back in Thor 1, Thor wasn't worthy, and he had to learn that about himself. His journey through Infinity War and Endgame is one of failure, and to Thor that makes him unworthy. He doesn't see that he acted with the best intentions. He sees that his actions led to billions of deaths. consequence. So if your actions lead to suffering, what do? You take the path of inaction. You isolate yourself, distract yourself with booze and gaming, convince yourself that you're okay, even if you're not. At least that way, the only person who gets hurt is you, right? Let's look at the scene where we're introduced to Fat Thor. Honestly, I think this is an example of point 3, when a character uses humour in a tragic moment to make it more poignant, because this is a tragic moment. Thor is not okay. When Thor asks Bruce if the thing he plans to fix was the cable, Thor never truly believed it. It's a form of defense, a wall he built up in his mind, and when Bruce speaks it plainly and uses the word Thanos, Thor has nowhere to hide anymore. The mask slips and instantly we see the torture in his expression as the bubble bursts and all the safeguards fall away. Seconds of silence as the pain comes closer and closer to the surface, and he begs Bruce to let him stay in this place of safety, his voice breaking as he becomes almost too emotional to talk. Don't you say that name. But Thor had to help. He knew he had to help. He was Thor, king of New Asgard, and as unworthy as he believed himself to be of that, after his failure, after 5 years of indulgence and isolation, he still had to try. As funny a comment as it is, the fact that all it took was the promise of beer on the ship to get Thor to agree to come along shows how refusing was never really an option. I do feel that the fat jokes were not necessarily handled in the best way. I mean, for characters like Tony, it makes sense for them to take the mick out of Thor for his beer-bellied bod, and for some of the characters to make less than sensitive jokes is fine, but it would have been nice if they explored more of the other side of it, the sympathetic side. This is why I think Thor's interaction with Frigga is honestly my favourite moment in the film. When he's confronted with some real sympathy, someone who isn't laughing or teasing, someone who comes from a place of love, he truly starts to heal. And when he gets there, he's given some real validation. I'm still worthy. And the relief in his expression and his voice is palpable as he's given the proof that depression, that failure, that being not okay doesn't make you unworthy. But let's talk about the screaming goat in the room, shall we? Thor Love and Thunder. This film is a mess humour-wise because it doesn't tie humour to characters. It's very much so, screaming goats are funny, so screaming goats. When the character traits are used for a laugh, it feels completely detached from the character that we've come to know and love. Namely, Thor isn't supposed to be a complete doofus anymore. If you have this guy and this guy in a scene together, and Quill is your voice of reason, I don't know what to tell you. If anything, Thor feels like he did in the first Thor film. Arrogant, careless, oblivious, rather than how he was in Infinity War and Endgame. Thor has been through massive development across the films, and it all went out the window in this one. As for humour and tragic moments, in this one, the humour distracts from them, rather than building them up. Kids get kidnapped, make it a joke. Sif is dying in Thor's arms, make it a joke. Jane dies. Okay, they made that one land, but notice that it was the absence of humour that made this work. In a comedy, one of the best moments is when it's not trying to be funny. So these are my thoughts on how humour works in the MCU, and why the humour is on the decline overall. If they want to find their former glory, I believe that the MCU needs to start really focus on creating a unique, entertaining cast of characters, and bringing the humour through them in a way that feels like a natural extension of themselves. But apart from that, thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed this video. Like and subscribe if you did. It lets me know that this is something you want to see more of. What do you think about how the MCU handles humour? Let me know in the comment section down below. And other than that, I'll see you next week with another video. Bye!